All right, folks, we're going to get started in our next panel here. So I'll just have those who are here in the auditorium to have a seat as we get started. I'll just sit here awkwardly until we get started. No. I did want to make a note. We're going to take a bit of a break after this panel before we get to our last panel of the day. But let's move to a conversation focused on telling the unheard stories of Texas, moderated by Elizabeth Melton, Public Engagement Director for the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life. She is joined today by Daniel Bolger, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Southern Methodist University, Upneet Kaur, Senior Education Manager of the Sikh Coalition, Rish Oberoi, Texas State Director for Indian American Impact, and Sumbel Zeb, who serves on the Board of Directors of Place 2, Collin County Central Appraisal District. Just a reminder, we'll have 45 minutes of moderated conversation and welcome your questions at texastribune.org/ask. And with that, I turn the program over to Elizabeth.
All right, thank you so much. Now, I'm excited because we get to continue the conversations we've been having today and thinking more about what stories often don't get told or what stories kind of often slip through the cracks. So to get started, will each of you share just a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Hello, everyone. My name is Upneet Kaur. As mentioned before, I'm the Senior Education Manager at the Sikh Coalition. We are a national civil rights organization founded in the aftermath of 9/11 by volunteers nationwide. And today we've grown into an organization that does work in advocacy, community development, education, the legal field, and communications. And our work spans a lot of different focus areas. Mine personally, it's on research and content development, advocacy work at the local, state, and national level, and also doing professional development. But in terms of our Texas-specific work, we've worked on social studies standards campaigns, textbook corrections, and more recently on the Bluebonnet curriculum and the 10 Commandments legislation, and just broader community engagement and legal cases regarding employment discrimination and bullying.
Hi, I'm Rish Oberoi. I'm the Texas State Director for Indian American Impact. I've been involved in the political space around Texas for almost 10 years now. And in terms of impact, we're a national organization. And we have three main areas of work. So the first is candidate support, and it's helping South Asian candidates around the country, everywhere from school board up to most recently U.S. President, try to run for office. We also run candidate training programs, more holistic programs to help with communities get involved with community engagement and civic education. And we also work on the issue advocacy side as well. So we're involved in legislatures around the country, federal legislation, things like that. And I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth and Tribune for having us all here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sumbel Zeb. I serve on the Collin Central Appraisal District. I'm also the secretary for the Collin County Democratic Party. I'm from the Muslim American community, and I've been doing civic engagement with the Muslim American and South Asian communities primarily for about the past 10 years here in Texas. I've done work for different national campaigns, state campaigns. As of late, I've done a little bit more of a focus on connecting the Muslim community with local races.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Bolger. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at Southern Methodist University. I am a sociologist by training, but do a lot of qualitative research, a lot of interviews and observations, meaning I am not much that different from a journalist many days. Broadly, my research focuses on how different systems and institutions in our society try and address social inequality. And so I've studied all sorts of different types of organizations, from disability assistance to scientific workplaces. But kind of the main thing I'll be focusing on today is probably the biggest area of my research, which is on the role of religious organizations in trying to alleviate inequality, particularly in U.S. cities. And so I did my dissertation on Houston. So a lot of the examples I'll be drawing on are from that project, but have begun a couple of projects in Dallas as well. So beginning to think about differences across cities, even within Texas. So.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the different communities that you work with, or the folks that you've been learning about in the work that you do.
I primarily work with the Sikh community here in Texas, but before getting into the context of that, I think it's important to understand that Sikhs are not generally a new population that have moved to the United States. They've been a part of the social fabric for over 125 years, initially coming to California and then later on New York and other states such as Texas. And the population here is primarily located in major cities and the surrounding areas, so Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, and is home to one of the first gurdwaras within the southern region of the United States, and the first in Texas, which received its 50-year historical Texas marker last year on their 50th anniversary, Gurdwara Sikh Center in Houston. The population that initially came here were engineers, doctors, and working in the agricultural field. And today you'll see that around 70,000 Sikhs live across the state and can be found in every facet of their life. But their issues range from a wide array of things, whether that be in public education in terms of language access or inclusion and bullying, but also in terms of articles of faith accommodations and employment discrimination and just larger considerations with visibility among their peers.
So despite the name Indian American Impact, we're a broadly South Asian group. So on the political side, we support anyone from the diaspora who's interested in running for office and has general alignment with what we've seen is with our various communities. And you hear this a lot with minority communities, right? No one's a monolith. I think that's especially true in the South Asian community. In fact, you can get quite granular in terms of how much of a monolith it is not. So, when I think it's something we're excited to discuss, right? But at least in the lens of journalism and stories untold, I think one of the things you see, right, it's tempting to, with something like Gaza or like Hindu nationalism to go ask those specific communities about these very big issues. But at the same time, I don't think we see enough asking like, what does the Muslim community think about abolishing the Department of Education? What does the Hindu community think about the voucher system, right? They'll disproportionately support Catholic schools and take away money from private schools, from public schools. So, in the lens of, like I said, understanding these stories, it gets certainly complicated, and it requires a lot of cultural competency. It's something we like to discuss a lot, and I think that frames a lot of the work we do. And that's us being a trusted messenger, but also enabling other groups, whether it's journalists, activists, government officials, whomever, to also be frankly competent in discussing these stories as well. So I'll pass it to Sumbel.
Yeah, I agree with a lot with what Rish had to say about how diverse these communities are. The Muslim community here, just in Texas, it's very diverse, it's racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, political ideology. So when I speak about the Muslim community, it's hard to speak about the Muslim community because we're very different, and we have a lot of the same issues that everyone else has. Like Rish was saying, of course, for example, I'll care about what's happening overseas, but I also care about, maternal health rates in Texas. I care about school vouchers. So these are also issues that matter to our community, and you'll see that we have very diverse opinions within our communities. So that's been interesting navigating. In recent years, I would say there has been a larger influx of the Muslim community from different parts of the country moving to Texas. And part of this is related to the fact that we have a lot of very popular Muslim institutions that have made Texas their homes, and we call them celebrity imams that have, an international following. They've made their home here in Texas. So I think what ends up happening is that we do tend to see more conservative-leaning Muslims from different parts of the country moving to Texas. So that's been interesting. But again, it's not across the board. Like the Black American Muslim community will vote very differently than maybe the South Asian Muslim community will.
I come to this question from a slightly different perspective, not as an advocate of a particular community, but as a researcher. And so a lot of my research has focused on the role of religious congregations and religious nonprofits in serving marginalized populations. And so one takeaway from that research for me that I think is maybe not an untold, but undertold, if I can change the language a little bit, story is the role that religious organizations play in our welfare system and the social safety net in the US. And so I did a lot of interviews over the last 5 or 6 years with social service recipients in Houston. I don't think it's probably lost on many of you in the room that Texas doesn't tend to be one of the more generous states when we look at a lot of welfare spending or social safety net programs. And so one takeaway I had from that research is really changed the way that I think about religion in places like Texas is how dependent the lives of the urban poor are on religious organizations. Week to week, month to month, going to food pantries, going to get financial assistance, going to do job training. In cities like Houston, and I don't think Houston is unique in this regard, a lot of places that provide those things are religious. And so even these groups that are not ostensibly practicing religious, they certainly in many cases are not Christian, they're navigating these really powerful organizations who are telling them how they can get aid, how often they can get it. So this religious sector, often I think we think about religion often in terms of worship services or maybe how religion comes into contact with politics. But sociologists often think about what we call poverty governance, so the ways that we as a society kind of control or shape the lives of people who are less fortunate than ourselves. And so a lot of my research has shown that religious organizations play this huge outsized role in how the poor are able to make ends meet in cities. And I think that has a big implication for how we think about the role of religion, not just in our cities, in places like Texas, but also in our broader society, that the lives of a lot of the most marginalized populations, and we do find the types of people visiting religious organizations are the most disadvantaged group of welfare recipients. They're often visiting these places and are subject to religious policies, restrictions, so on and so forth, even though they're not religious themselves. And so I think that's something we intuitively know, that congregations or organizations serve the poor. I think I've been struck and want to impress upon you how dependent many people's lives are on these types of organizations.
Yeah, and just a point of connection there, Daniel, is I think going to different houses of worship is a great way to see how communities interact with each other beyond just looking at the religious aspect of it. For instance, for many Sikhs that migrated to America and even here in Texas, Gurdwaras is not only a place that they congregated to worship, it was also where they exchanged opportunities, where they learned how to get used to a new place together for their kids to have a sense of community, and also to get the resources that were mentioned as well.
I love that we're getting to hear more of like the complexity and the everydayness of what some of the untold or lesser told stories may be of different folks in Texas. So I'm interested to learn some more about the challenges of representation that are facing the communities that each of you have worked with, either as an advocate or as a researcher. And so what have you witnessed when it comes to translating community experiences to various media outlets? Sumbel?
So in my experience, what happens often is that when we're approached by journalists, the most common topic is Islamophobia. In January of this year, there was that incident in Louisiana, and someone from the Dallas Morning News reached out to me, and I was honestly like, I don't know if I want to respond to this because, I've been talking about Islamophobia since 9/11, but I did because I thought that it was important to have a Muslim woman speaking on the issue, because that's one of the other issues that we run into often, is that I think often we'll see journalists go to either the imams at our mosque or the board members, or maybe CARE, which is one of the more older institutions. And as a result, you often don't hear from Muslim women in the community, or just, quote unquote, just what regular Muslims are doing. Again, we just often we want to talk about things other than Islamophobia. The same issues that other communities face, including in our mosques, in our schools. Sometimes we have topics that I've seen that journalists are hesitant to discuss because the reason why was that they didn't want to contribute to Islamophobia. But these are real issues that we're dealing with, and sometimes we also need to be able to speak about this or bring light to these issues.
So like the maybe if there's a debate within the community or something like that.
Right, exactly.
I guess big thing I can add to that. So, from a political lens, we do this research every year, and more than half of, actually this is South Asians, but AAPI in general, so more than half of South Asians are not contacted by their political party during election seasons, election cycles, and I think that translates into when it comes time to have a seat at the table, right? Whether it's in a legislative sense or the issues being covered from a journalistic standpoint, it fails to happen. And if it does happen, there, frankly, it often, I've seen this, I know you've seen this too, there's an air of tokenism that occurs as well. And it's not always, it's not heinous. It's not, I don't think it's deliberate, right? I mean, a lot of it comes from, as I mentioned before, that cultural competency, right? So being able to elevate those voices and coming back time and time again, it's one thing you pop in for a story, you ask someone once, and you don't talk to them again for 5 years, right? But I think at this point, like our various communities have enough built-in infrastructure, whether it's, community organizers or leaders or whatever, are here, they're on the ground, they know what's going on, they're plugged in, but I don't think they get contacted frequently enough, whether it's by policymakers or journalists. But yeah.
And to add to what was said before, I think another component that we really want to emphasize is responsible and respectful coverage of different issue areas, and that often doesn't happen, and as a result, issues just go uncovered. But I think we're touching on resources a bit later in this conversation, but a lot of it is because in some cases, context and terminology aren't really well known, and also local contexts are very hard to identify, whether that be because of a linguistic barrier or being able to access different members of the community. But I really want to emphasize that those three things are very central to some of the challenges that are faced with reporting. And another one is sort of this narrative about being victims of hate crimes, which is something that is important to our community that should be reported on. But as mentioned by Sumbel right before me, that the community is more than that. There's so much to celebrate. There's so much triumph that the community has had over the years. And there's such a deep history that also warrants discussion. So yeah, I think those are additional points to consider here.
So I love getting to hear some of this insight, and because there are organizations, right, like the Texas Tribune and other folks that are trying to do more community-based kind of work and outreach and thinking how to build those relationships. So I'm a scholar who does community-based work, and I know that it's very complicated and it can be time-consuming and challenging. So what advice do each of you have for folks looking to build those meaningful relationships? And I think building those competencies too, like you were talking about, Rish. So what do you wish that these journalistic or other kind of even community-based partners could know?
Can respond to my emails more would be great.
Well, we all want that.
But I mean, I can't speak for every organization, right? But I see it's out there a lot, right? And it gets very specific. Like I said, we're broadly South Asian, right? But there's Sikh-specific groups. There's not just Muslim groups. There's Indian Muslim-specific groups, right? I mean, there's an entire Indian Muslim Chamber of Commerce in Houston. So I mean, it's there. I'll say, frankly, I feel like at this point, communities are doing all they can to put this information out there. And so it's just a simple fact, like I said, maintaining these relationships, come to the events, check out the different things we're doing. We were just at the Capitol last week. We did a huge South Asian Desi Day of Action over there. Like I said, I mean, it's there. Something about bringing the horse to water and all that. But I think the opportunities are abound.
I want to point out one journalist from the Dallas Morning News, Ho-Jin Choi. I think he's been doing a really good job, actually. He's done a lot of reporting on the different charitable work that the Muslim community has been doing, on the work that Muslim women-led organizations are doing in the domestic abuse space. And I think it's partially due to the fact that he plugs himself into the community. He shows up at our events, he builds those connections, he might be in some of the WhatsApp groups, so it can be done.
I don't know how many of you know a sociologist, but I want to be upfront. We're not known for our optimism. So I wanted to share, I think you should have a sociologist in your life in case that wasn't clear. But I wanted to share an abject example of approach I don't think works, or perhaps a misnomer we might have about community. So I do a lot of community-based research. So this is a lesson I learned as well. I think as we talk about religious communities or even geographic communities, like I said, a lot of my work is focused on low-income neighborhoods in major cities in Texas. I think we have this intuitive idea that there's a community voice or representative that we can talk to that's going to be able to easily distill what this community is about, what they value. I found in a lot of my research interviewing nonprofit leaders, church leaders, people who receive social services, there's a lot of different views out there on what the community needs, what we should value, what we should be working towards. So I guess my encouragement on that front is to think of community voices rather than a singular voice. And just think, as a sociologist, to lend some numbers to this, I ran across a study recently in Chicago where they interviewed people on the south side of Chicago about who would best represent their interests. And two things were notable for that study. One, the group that scored the lowest were aldermen. So the democratically elected representatives were seen as the least best representatives of what those people were thinking. The second is none of the groups scored above 40%, meaning churches, schools, nonprofits, elected officials. In other words, there's a lot of variation in views, not just of religious communities, what they need, what they're doing, what they value, but also of geographic communities. And I think recognizing that variation, plugging yourself into a community rather than getting a single source, is often a good way to understand that often these communities, religious or otherwise, have a lot of complexity to them and a lot of variation in views about what's needed, what's not needed, and what people value.
Yeah, and to build off of that, there is a very large variance that we've seen over the years in our work between every Sangat or community that exists not just within different states, but even in different cities. So two core components of our work is our community development team and our media and communications team, and both are focused on both receiving the stories and the experiences of our community, and then on our media and communication side, working to uplift those stories in an accurate manner. So a resource that the Sikh Coalition has developed for reporters with the Religion News Foundation, is a reporter's guide, which provides a overview of demographics, our history both in the United States and the origins of the religion, how to respectfully visit a gurdwara, frequently asked questions, and specific calendar dates to look out for. I think that is a great starting point, and I know that there are other community organizations that do develop similar resources. And another thing is that with our work in our community development team, we are connected with different gurdwaras or Sikh houses of worship and different community members in different cities. So we can serve sort of as a connecting point for reporters with community members that can speak to different experiences, whether that be a student or a parent, a community leader, somebody that has certain stories that they want to uplift. That's a point of connection we can make, but also something that we do offer in collaboration between our education team and others is a Sikh awareness presentation or training. If there's a staff or anybody one-on-one wants to learn more about the faith and the Sikh experience.
That's great. I would love to hear if there are other resources that any of you would like to recommend, or I think, too, we can come back to a conversation about even this diversity within Texas. But what about some resources or things you really want people to know are coming up?
Yeah, actually, this is pretty timely. We just launched a new initiative. It's Immigrants Who Impact. You can see it's on our website, iimpact.org. But exactly this, right? We're trying to uplift stories from around the country, right? And it's not just like, oh, look, this CEO is Indian, right? I mean, these are very real human stories, things that people are dealing with, right? Whether it's, what am I going to do if my school gets defunded because all the money's going to a local Catholic school, right? Or what am I going to do, with a million things going on that are actually affecting day-to-day lives. And so it's probably been one of the more successful post-election projects we've started. I mean, people are chomping at the bit to get these stories out there, right? People want to make sure that the rest of the country knows just exactly like how we are dealing with this, right? I mean, our different various communities are contributing so much to this country, and especially in a time where it feels like it's being taken for granted a lot. Like I say, I think it's extremely important to highlight, and that's so that's a big resource we're working on at the moment.
An event that I would like to highlight, it'll be occurring in, I would say, like nearly every Sikh house of worship, is the celebration of Vaisakhi that's upcoming on April 14th. And a Gurdwara is a space that is open to anyone, regardless of your background, religious faith, anything, as long as the basic ground rules are respected of the Gurdwara. And I know that many Gurdwaras will put on special celebrations during this time. So connecting on that, I think, is a great way not only to learn more about the different celebrations and these events that the community gets together, but also see how in a Gurdwara you can see how different practices of the religion are carried out, and different values are seen reflected in those spaces as well.
Okay, so I was also thinking as we were talking, right, that a lot of the conversations we've been having today are focused perhaps maybe in some of the more urban centers in Texas, right? We're here today in Dallas. We've got a lot of folks here from Houston, maybe some folks from Austin. When we think about Texas, and we think about, the different communities that either you've been working for or working alongside, we've been talking about the complexity of this all day, right? But what's some of the nitty-grittiness that you think maybe gets left out of the narrative sometimes, if we just kind of try to focus on, those representative stories? Does that make sense?
Okay. I think one point, and we had this discussion when we had met prior to the session, is the engagement of different religious groups with public life. A lot of the issues, as Sumbel has pointed out, that are impacting other Texans are also impacting different religious and cultural groups across Texas. And there is advocacy effort that is engaged on in regards to that, whether that be on things impacting public education through state standards and engagement with the different boards of education, whether it be on legislative issues. And I think those perspectives are often overlooked in those spaces. And I think they do have a very high impact. For instance, if you look at a Sikh student that already doesn't see themselves reflected in the classroom, whether it be in history and English, and then on top of that, you add on this display of the 10 Commandments in their classroom, you add on this new curriculum where they're learning once again that their faith is mentioned once, if that. So yeah, I think stories like that are very important to highlight.
I think something interesting that's happening with the Muslim community in Texas right now and elsewhere is that, the past year or two, there was a lot of political engagement. People were very concerned about what was happening in Gaza, and it was just like this fervor. People who were never engaged before were just hyper engaged, and I think that, subsequent to the elections, a lot of people are burnt out, and I see not everyone, but most people have retreated. And so there needs to be some work done where we are able to re-engage these communities. There needs to be some conversations, building trust on all sides. So that's something that I think that at least I see on the horizon.
Yeah, just to chime in briefly, I think speaking to kind of the urban-rural variation as well, I think one thing that's true across both urban, rural, suburban settings, and I think certainly social scientists often miss, and I wonder if journalists often miss too, is religious organizations do a lot other than sponsor worship services or assist in people in developing their faith. Most recent study I found that 83% of U.S. congregations provide some type of social service to non-members. Many of the organizations, both congregations and nonprofits I studied in Houston, were involved in things ranging from trying to prevent gentrification to land use decisions to local public policy, educational classes, the list goes on and on. So I think if we limit our view of religion just to kind of houses of worship sponsoring worship, we're missing a lot of how religion takes place. And I think that's true both in urban settings and rural settings, where often congregations or religious organizations are the only provider of certain types of services, amenities, advocacy. And so I think this is an area that I think social scientists often struggle to grasp, and I think journalists can benefit from as well, is really widening the aperture, so to speak, of how we understand religion happening and the types of things that religious organizations are doing. And I think that's especially true in immigrant communities or communities that otherwise lack certain types of resources.
And something I add, sounds like classic intersectionality, right? I mean, if we want to think about all the different ways we're plugging in, but I'll give you kind of a nefarious take too. I mean, we discussed this before, but it's interesting. Cultural competency can cut the other way too, right? So I think, I'll give you an example, like Fort Bend County, right, is one of the first or second most diverse county in the United States, depending on who you ask, but large South Asian population, extremely diverse, both culturally, economically, however you want to cut it, and just by extension of there being such a large community, it's become very politically active, and the South Asians become very involved in the political scene. But as the political power has grown, so have divisions. And what we've seen over the last several years are different groups who've learned to take advantage of these divisions. They understand where exactly to poke and prod to stir things up. And so that's something I don't really hear covered a whole lot. It happens every election cycle. These things pop up, funded by various groups, and they vanish away into the ether after the election, but it's very targeted, and then frankly they're getting better at it, and so it's kind of being informed in the most nefarious way possible.
Yeah, it makes me think about what's happening currently. We're talking about rural parts of Texas as well, and it makes me think of the story right now with Governor Abbott's attacks on Epic, and it's I don't know how much coverage has focused on the fact that that congregation tends to be politically very conservative and supportive of the GOP, and there's a bit of a shock in that community that they're being attacked by the same people they've been fundraising for and voting for and campaigning for. So I'm not sure if that's maybe something that's been ignored a bit, that shift in the political ideology of the Muslim community here, but that is something.
Yeah, and can you explain what EPIC is for some folks if they're not plugged into that story?
Yeah, so EPIC is the East Plano Islamic Center. So it's a mosque, which is like a nonprofit entity, right? But then they also started a real estate development that's called Epic City. I'm assuming that they used the same name to draw attraction to it from the same people who attend Epic. And I mean that it's a separate entity, but I believe the idea behind Epic City was to have a neighborhood that would have like private Islamic schools and the mosque, and you could walk there, and your apartments there, and your houses there, and someone announced it on Twitter and, caught the attention of some right-wing Islamophobes, and it just turned into a huge political theater, I guess. But at this point, the attacks that are coming from Governor Abbott's office are against both Epic, the mosque, and Epic City.
Yeah, and that's what's come as a surprise, right? All right, do we have other things that y'all want to add on to our conversation today before we move into questions? Okay, do we have questions already, or I can create some myself?
right, so just a reminder, texastribune.org/ask. We have a couple examples in. I will say what I've appreciated with this kind of larger consideration of telling the unheard stories of Texas from a journalism perspective. You also have an industry that's is deeply challenged itself. Some of the things that the Tribune, as with other organizations, but that we've been looking at are issues of news avoidance, and did a series of listening sessions this past year. And part of what we heard is the number of people who turn away from the news, one, because for their own mental health, it's difficult for them. It's not for a lack of interest in being informed. But one of the other issues is just the sheer amount of noise that is out there. I kind of use that kind of to preface questions, and there were a couple examples here, but are there some other examples of stories, whether it be through journalism or by other means, that were able to capture the nuance and complexity of some of the issues within, your communities that had an impact? And can you kind of deconstruct a bit as to why it seemed effective? That's a lot, but I want to give you. I'm going to keep talking here so that you can think a few seconds to answer. But I mean, are there some examples? I think it was the Dallas Morning News reporter that seemed to be part of that was establishing some presence, some regular presence that was effective. But other examples that you can think of that may give us some ideas of what we can lean into more.
Yeah, I think one of the things, at least at the Sikh Coalition, that we produce, there are resources primarily for our community to understand how these larger attacks that are happening or different things would impact them on a personal level, but I think it also provides insight to journalists or those that are interested in learning more about the different things that the community is considering. The thing that comes to mind most recently is that we released basically our response to the Dear Colleague letter that came out regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the term is very broad, and for our community members, a huge component is like helping them understand how it's impacting them in a way that they can, and also in Punjabi. But in there you can find that like how we have considerations of like, well, anything can be labeled as DEI, like essential programs, which allow for religious accommodations for articles of faith, for Sikhs who have unshorn hair, who wear patkas, and the other articles of faith such as a Qur'an or Qurban, language accessibility, so access to Punjabi translation services, and also departments that allow for Sikh awareness trainings in places that otherwise the Sikh faith is never covered for educators and students alike, and things like that. So I think resources put out by community organizations for the community, I think, are equally helpful in providing that context.
Can you, apologies if you touched on this, but can you speak a bit to how those resources are best distributed? Like, is it wide? Is it narrow but deep to a specific community?
They're distributed with the intention of being accessible and usable by other communities. For instance, when we create FAQs, it is our hope that other religious and cultural communities can have it. So all these resources are publicly and freely available for anyone. And we have different avenues of sharing them, whether that be on our website, through our email listservs, and with other organizations doing similar work for other communities.
Are there other examples of stories being told with impact, again, whether it be through journalism or other means that can be helpful for us?
Yeah, I'll give you a good example. Actually, I think the Tribune did a pretty good job. This was, I think, the last legislative session. So there was a bill had to they were going to put 10 commandments in schools. Basically, it was the crux of the bill. At the time, it seemed like one of those things they just thought it would slip through, right? But between the journalistic covering and the work of different advocacy groups, there's a pretty broad coalition, I think, that came together to prevent something like that happening. And when you think about it, I mean, there was, in terms of bills, I think that were problematic for South Asian communities, for example. I mean, that was probably kind of lower on the list, but I think at the same time, it was really emblematic of this growing idea of feeling undervalued, right? Especially here in Texas, right? These communities people have been here a long time, like I said, contributed so much, and then the state kind of wants to spit in your face and like shove a particular religion down your throat. So I think, approaching it from that lens, I mean, that was one of the few times we saw like so much unity, I think, between the different groups, right? To come together for something kind of small, but very specific and like could have potentially, right, if you get that through, what's next, right? Is it, the full chaplain thing? Is it, completely converting schools into religious-run schools? So I found that to be very effective. I know someone's got a little experience with like the thing that happened in Plano as well. I think the media coverage was spot on there. It did a great job. And I don't know if you want to mention more about that. You're more involved.
Oh, yeah. In Plano, it was all over the news. There was, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 women of Indian origin. They were outside of a restaurant in Plano, and they were accosted by a lady who just was very racist, and I think she threatened them with a gun, or she might have actually physically assaulted one of them, and it was just this racist tirade. But I think that thanks in part to community organizing from the South Asian community, the Hindu community, there was a lot of good media coverage on that story.
We have a few additional questions here. Marissa from Fort Worth asks, what does interfaith work look like between your religious communities and others? I'm curious what challenges interfaith dialogue and action faces today compared to the past.
I can't speak for every organization's interaction, but I would say in the interfaith work that we've done recently with other faith organizations at the state and national level, it has been more of a positive experience of being able to highlight the perspectives of, for instance, the Sikh community and how this impacts us within the broader scope of things. We heard earlier about this broader push that we're seeing with Christian nationalism, and I feel like it's easy for that conversation easily to seclude religions that are not as well covered, primarily in different news services, in different advocacy work, but it has been a space that has been very inclusive of including other religions that are just as equally impacted by the passage of such legislation.
I would say the interfaith work is pretty critical in the organizing space. So what I mentioned earlier about trusted messengers, right, to communities. So if we're, like, give you an example, if we're doing like a voter turnout thing, right, or something around a specific issue, and we're trying to, so we like at Impact, for example, I mean, we'll think very specifically about things like, geographically, like what state is this in? Is it a suburb? Is it a city? And then are we targeting like an area that's broadly like, truly diverse South Asian, or is this like a very more homogenous community, right? And so, thinking about how to target. So, what's another example? So we do this. In the past, we've done like anti-misinformation programs, right? And so, South Asian community. That's one thing. Like it's monolithic. Everyone's on WhatsApp in the South Asian community, and it's become an invaluable tool for us in terms of organizing. So we've done work like rapid response programs. So if someone says, hey, this is going around the community WhatsApp group with 500 people in, it's just blatantly false, we'll enable those folks to be able to go back into their communities, right? It's not helpful for us to just tweet it out. People don't know who we are, right? And so being able to give those tools to people already in those communities to go back and combat that misinformation is helpful.
But are you using WhatsApp like specifically to make sure you are like reaching the right folks within the community who are trusted, who can then share?
It goes both ways, right? I mean, we're using WhatsApp as our avenue, but we're also recognizing that WhatsApp is like this very big presence within these communities, right? That and information flies pretty quick through it. I
did want to ask that that larger question. There's what happens when, or perhaps one of the consequences if those stories aren't being told, is how quickly misinformation, disinformation can get out there. And so there's a couple questions here about successful strategies to counter that. You just gave one, and I'm wondering if anyone else on the panel has an example of being able to successfully, counter that misinformation or disinformation out there.
In terms of journalism or more broadly?
So I mean, no. So it's certainly fair if part of it is bad journalism that put disinformation or misinformation out there. But I guess the other would be if journalism, isn't playing a role in being able to fact check that or tamper it successfully. Have there been? Are you aware of other strategies that have been able to successfully address it?
Yeah, I think a part our efforts, like if we do see something that is reported incorrectly in journalism, is that we do try our best to reach out to the author that wrote it and to provide the correction with the context that is needed on the issue at hand. But more broadly, methods that we have found out that have helped, one of them is WhatsApp. That's where you can primarily reach not only the most amount of community members, but also community leaders that are signing on behalf of trying to stop this disinformation at different houses of worship and different community leaders. But we found out that also coordinating with other local organizations similarly being impacted by the disinformation also helps. We've seen this with work that we've done related to social studies standards and inclusion in things such as curriculum as well. And yeah, I think that, and also providing public testimony in different spaces.
I don't mean to keep picking on Epic, but because it's just in the news right now, I think that what happened with them was showed a little bit of how not to respond, like how an organization should not respond to something like what happened to them. I feel like it was probably almost a month of the governor's attacks and these comments and then these press releases, and Epic had not responded publicly. And so, as organizations, we also have a responsibility to, have your media comms team ready and your plan of action and how to respond under, because there was a lot. I had people asking me from outside of the Muslim community saying that, oh, we want to advocate for Epic. We know that this is a political, what do you call it, a hunt? I don't know. But we're not getting any direction from Epic, and we're not getting a response from them, so we don't know how to respond. So I think that's maybe on the organization side. We also need to maybe still work on how we're working with the media.
Pre-written press releases, if you think that there's going to be an issue, yeah.
Right, yeah.
I think this gets at one of the challenges here too, and what is the role of journalism and the limits of journalism in some cases. Julie from Dallas writes, while negative tropes, harmful stereotypes, and microaggressions frequently arise when stories are told about and not directly from or by impacted communities, what would you ideally want to see in terms of positive portrayals, meaningful, timely topics, and general themes in reporting on these communities in Texas?
It sounded like they were kind of touching on the model minority aspect, right? Is that kind of the direction? So, that's an interesting one. The positive stereotypes can be very hurtful, right? Because then there's this built-in assumption that those communities are fine, right? For example, South Asians overwhelmingly disproportionately have heart health issues, right? Or diabetic issues, or just like other people of color are more likely to live near toxic waste, right? Environmental hazards. Same thing with education, right? And then obviously English proficiency, not as big of an issue, but still exists, especially with newer immigrants, newer voters, right? So language access is a big deal. So, it's so like I said, it gets really harmful, I think, to say everyone's CEO, everyone's wealthy and whatnot. But we know for a fact that the communities that are, especially if you're South Asian, if you're working class, you're dealing with a health issue. I mean, your outcomes are not going to be very good at all, right? 'Cause especially there's there's that built-in assumption that this community is already fine, and then there's already less social structures, right? And these are not communities that aren't necessarily plugged in to understand like what resources are available to them. So, that's a great question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there are two parts of it. I think what was just touched on and the problems that arise from someone telling stories about a community and not representing that community. And I don't want to speak for the industry, but there is a sense of journalists having, like, part of the responsibility is to try to tell that story. It can't be the same as someone from that community. And I'm just wondering about that tension and any comments you have, and is there a place with, as problematic as social media is, or other tools for telling stories, for communities telling their stories alongside the role of journalism? Now, one could say have diverse newsrooms in better representation, for sure. But I guess that larger question, the tension between who's telling the stories.
Yeah, I think to that question, it is essential to have the community's perspective, and I just want to reiterate, at least from the Sikh perspective, the Sikh Coalition will try its best to connect journalists if they're interested in hearing from a local community member or from somebody that has experienced something similar to what is being written about, so they can directly receive those stories. There usually is posts that you will see from different Sikh community members posted across social media, but it's once again hard to really get the entire story without directly talking to the individual.
I guess the last question here, and then we'll take a bit of a break before our last panel. You've touched on some of these, but I'd love to hear from each of you. What are the questions? What are some of the questions journalists need to be asking in Texas? What are the questions that immediately come to your mind that should be at the top of newsrooms' lists of, not even to a specific issue, but rather how they look over a longer period of time?
No. One of the fun parts about being a social scientist is you often set out to investigate something and find something totally different. And so I want to share an example of that and to kind of maybe frame this question. This is several years ago. I was on a project with an advisor studying how science comes up in Black, Latino, and Korean American congregations. And the short version is it didn't that much. What did come up a lot and was not something we set out to study was mental health care. And we published that study. It's not the best thing I've ever written, but it's by far gotten the most attention because I think it touched a vein. And I've since kind of continued that project in Dallas and talked to people in more predominantly whites or more affluent congregations. Same story. And the story is this, that people in congregations and houses of worship in various types of religious spaces often rely on religious leaders for mental health care. And often those leaders feel very ill-prepared to provide that care. So there's been a lot of journalistic coverage of the mental health care crisis, not just a rise in post-COVID in terms of various types of mental health conditions, but also epidemics of loneliness and disconnection. And what I want to suggest, and what I'm finding in our research, is that congregations and religious organizations are often the front lines of that. But I don't think they're being discussed in that way. And what I'm finding, and I would encourage journalists to look into as well, is this is creating an incredible tax on religious leaders, broadly understood, in terms of not having much training to deal with these types of concerns, but being asked to spend a disproportionate amount of their time, often dealing with very serious mental health issues. And often, as you might imagine, this is even disproportionately concentrated in communities that tend to have less resources. So I think this is part of a story, the mental health care stuff that's been talked about a lot, but I don't think the religious stuff has been talked about, and I think it's a big part of the kind of the front lines of where this crisis is happening.
Like while he was talking about that, I thought of, oh yes, that is something that's happening in the Muslim community. So I wonder if maybe instead of us thinking of, these are the topics that journalists should be asking about, just maybe having a more open-ended why don't you tell me what are some topics that we should be talking about? And just hearing different perspectives from multiple members of that community, because I mean, also what's happening in the community changes day by day, right?
I mean, I'll just kind of reiterate kind of what we touched on in the beginning, right? I mean, it's like I said, it's tempting to come, when there's something Indian specific or Muslim specific, let's go ask someone from my community about that issue, right? But we have, like I said, we have plenty of opinions on public safety, on healthcare, insurance rates, property taxes. All these things affect all of us, and I think that's I would say when we talk about these communities feeling less valued, I think that would go a long way to kind of making communities feel like they're having a seat at the table again, or just being brought up to the issues that are affecting everybody, right? Not just these big ticket things that what things going around the world, or very specific to a community, right? Because I mean, the fact is, if but a hate crime occurs, the whole state didn't stop to see what was happening there, right? That was big in our community. It was big in especially urban areas where there's less tolerance for that. But in terms of what our communities are caring about, right? It's the same day-to-day kitchen table issues that everyone else is dealing with, right? And we have opinions on it.
Yeah. And this is a point that was brought up earlier by Daniel, but I think it's really important to emphasize or to think about how communities and houses of worship are interacting with their communities outside of that space as well. For instance, something I think goes highly underreported is how the Sikh tenet of seva or selfless service is facilitated throughout different communities. It's something that we see across state lines that is happening. If there is a national disaster, when there was the pandemic, the Sikh community often comes together to provide resources, free meals, and sometimes even the Sikh house of worship as a place of shelter for anyone that needs access to it. And these community engagement efforts are not just limited to disaster. These engagements happen on a monthly and weekly basis in some places to really give back to their communities. So yeah, once again, emphasizing sort of how different religious groups interact with their community at large.
We are grateful to our panel for this really important conversation. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then reconvene for our last panel, but let's give our panel a round of applause.